Hi, welcome to my two-part lecture on media evaluation. In this first lecture, I'll be talking about some key concepts of media evaluation. Before I get into the lecture, I want to apologize. My monitor that's over here, which I use to engage with content, it's on the fritz. I'll have to fix it. In the meantime, I'm going to be reading content when I need to read it off my monitor here, so I'm going to be looking down instead of over. Hopefully that's not too distracting. Anyway, to get into the lecture, I've presented this slide before. It's about the marketing process, which begins with some sort of audience analysis or segmentation, developing a marketing strategy, implementing that strategy, and then hoping for behavior change. And previously I've talked about this link here between implementation and change. Today's lecture also focuses on that, and it asks the question, how do you know? How do you know the campaign and the messages that were implemented led to the desired change? This is all about media evaluation, but before I get to media evaluation, I'd like to talk about an experiment I did last year. This is the type of behavior change I'm interested in as a social scientist. How can I study theoretically interesting concepts? And so I did this experiment trying to encourage good recycling behavior. I had research participants come into a lab. There was a mock yogurt drink taste test study where participants would receive a small plastic cup with a yogurt sample. They'd be directed into a tasting station. It was a little private booth where they could sample the yogurt drink, fill out a survey, and then discard the yogurt cup. And you'll notice in the tasting booth here, there was a sink and then a couple of bins, a recycling bin in green and then a rubbish bin in brown. Now this was one of the experimental conditions. Half the participants saw this when they went in the booth and the other half saw this. On the way into the booth, they would have walked past the rubbish bin, which was located behind a partition, so it was less convenient. It wasn't as close to the tasting station as in the first condition. And here I was interested in how did this manipulation affect the recycling rate. I think you'll be unsurprised to find out that the recycling rate wasn't that high when the bins were equally convenient, but when the recycling bin was relatively more convenient than the rubbish bin, the recycling rate skyrocketed. And this makes sense. I kind of shifted the default option. When the participants were finished with their taste test and they turned around to dispose of the tasting cup, well, the recycling bin was right there, and the rubbish bin, well, they knew it was around the corner, but that was too far away. They probably all knew recycling was good, so yeah, they did the recycling thing. But is this a good thing? A problem in Singapore and many other parts of the world is that recyclables are often contaminated with food waste. This study I did intentionally used a sticky beverage so that there would be food residue left over. And so when the recycling rate increased in the second condition, it probably also increased the amount of contaminated items going into that bin. It was important that before recycling those items, the participants rinse them out in the sink. Fortunately, there was a sink right there, so that wouldn't have been too difficult, right? Well, there was still a pretty high contamination rate, and I knew that would be the case, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to test message effects. And so I created a couple posters. One was, did you know more and more NTU students are recycling? Please recycle responsibly. The other one had the same information, plus it had some information about what is an acceptable level of cleanliness. How clean do your recyclables need to be? And it showed different levels of contamination, and it basically said this is what you need to do. You need to get it to this cleanest yes state in order for it to be recyclable, and it needed to be almost spotless. I learned that from consulting with the public waste collectors in Singapore, who are the ones in charge of the recycling. And so then I looked at the effect of these posters. Specifically, I focused my analysis on what happens when, in that condition when 95% of people are recycling. I looked at the cups that were placed in that green recycling bin, and depending on whether the poster just said please recycle responsibly or whether the poster had information about how clean they need to be, I analyzed the differences. And I was interested in measuring or comparing the contamination level. The lowest contamination level had a value of 1, and so that's an example of that is the yes image. And then it had a value of 5, the most contaminated level, which is the furthest left of those images, where there was still quite a bit of yogurt drink in there. So I observed how much contamination was in each of these cups, and I compared the two conditions. So the average contamination when it was a basic recycling poster was almost 4. That was a pretty high degree of contamination. On the other hand, when the poster said this is how clean they need to be, well, there was still quite a bit of contamination, but it was much lower, significantly lower. And so what this showed is that when there are these manipulations of the physical environment that create positive behavior change, well, sometimes it's not really positive behavior. The behavior is being done more, but it's not being done in the right way. And sometimes the right type of messages is what it takes to push people a little more toward the ideal behavior. So this experiment I did had a couple aspects to it. There was on one hand, there was the manipulation of the bin locations. On the other hand, there was the manipulation of the poster contents. Now, the bin manipulation had to do with physical changes, making the rubbish bin less convenient. The poster manipulation had to do with informational changes, including a specific type of information instructing the respondents on how clean their recyclables needed to be. And so if I were interested in evaluating these outcomes, on the one hand, I'd be interested in a nudge evaluation, somehow measuring behavior. Well, I presented the behavior, so somehow measuring and presenting the behavior in a way that allows some insights to be drawn from that manipulation. And then for the poster aspect of it, media evaluation is the approach to take, understanding how the changes in media messages led to changes in attitudes and behaviors. And so I'm going to be focusing on the media evaluation aspect, but that doesn't mean that the physical changes aspect, the bins aspect, isn't interesting. In fact, there's a whole lot of research about this. There's an interesting book by a couple of famous economists called Nudge. It's a really easy read. It's meant for the general public. It's not too academic. And it talks about how these manipulations in the physical environment can lead to fairly significant behavioral changes. So I encourage you to read that book if these are the types of things that interest you. But of course, in this lecture, I'll be focusing on media evaluation. Now, there are lots of different types of media, and media evaluation is really about understanding how people access those media, how people are exposed to those media, how they think about the messages, and how those messages ultimately affect their behavior. News media is very much about reporting on current events. Often this leads to people engaging in discussions with each other about those events. Sometimes it can lead to political change. Entertainment media, the evaluations often focus on things like enjoyment. Educational media, the evaluation often focuses on learning outcomes. Social media encapsulates all these other types of media. You can find news and entertainment and education all on social media. But social media evaluation focuses more on the social processes, how ideas are transmitted from person to person. And then, of course, what I'm going to be focusing on is marketing media, how media can be used to promote ideas as part of a marketing plan. And there are a couple main categories of media evaluation that are employed in marketing research. The first is process evaluation. Process evaluation is how a message or how audiences are exposed to a message, how they come to pay attention to it, and then how they initially react to it. And so the question that this level of evaluation concerns is whether the message is reaching and connecting with the audiences or not. The other aspect of media evaluation is outcome evaluation. This focuses on when messages are produced, how does that change the audience in terms of attitudes, knowledge, and behavior? And so a question here essentially is, did the message achieve the desired results or not? Now, there are different types of questions that campaigners need to ask to evaluate these different levels of media evaluation. So for measuring or evaluating exposure and recall, it's good to ask questions like, did you see the message? Do you remember seeing it? Or even going a little bit deeper and asking audiences to recall specific aspects of the message. What do you remember about it? And if audiences can remember details, it suggests not only were they exposed to it, but they were paying attention. Reactions and receptivity can be measured with questions like, what did you think of the message? Did you think it was a good message? Did you think it was credible? Was it relevant to you? Did you share the message with people who are similar to you? Behavioral determinants has to do with the factors that ultimately lead to behavior. These are things like changes in knowledge and attitudes and beliefs. And so some questions that are relevant here are, what did you learn from these messages, and how has your opinion changed? And then finally, there are behavioral outcomes, and this really focuses on what audiences are doing differently now than they were doing before. And I'm going to relate this now to the previous slide, where the first two and a little bit into the third group of questions here is about process evaluation, that exposure and recall, reactions and receptivity, and then getting a little bit into things like attitude change. But then attitude change, knowledge change, belief change, and behavior change is all about outcome evaluations. Earlier I talked about the experiment I conducted, and I presented the results of the manipulations. Those were examples of outcome evaluations. Did the manipulations lead to the intended outcomes? And I found, yes, indeed, they did. But there was a little bit of process evaluation as part of that study too, especially when it came to the posters. I knew in advance that if the posters were to be effective, if they were to lead to change, the participants in the study had to notice them first and then be aware of what the contents were. And so at the end of the experiment, I had a survey that asked some questions. And I can't read it off the screen from here, but essentially it was asking, were you aware of the poster, and to what extent do you think it had information about how clean recyclables need to be? And to the extent that audiences were aware of the poster and its content, I could say, yes, that's the reason why they were influenced by the poster. All right, I'd like to finish up this lecture with a few points about ways to effectively conduct outcome evaluation or media evaluation, ways to do that effectively and not so effectively. So first, what I see in quite a few, at least large-scale student campaigns, is a tendency to evaluate the campaign by surveying the people who come to the campaign event. Now, campaign events are useful tools because it's about sharing the campaign with a small community of individuals who care about those types of things. And it's good to talk to those people and understand the ideas that come from people who attend these events. But talking to those people won't tell you much about how a general audience will respond. And so unless the entire target audience comes to the event, surveying the people at the event isn't going to tell you much. You have to survey a larger population. Ideally, you'd take a random sample of the entire target demographic. So I see these a lot on YouTube, and I think this is an example of process evaluation by marketing companies. Often these types of YouTube surveys are interested in knowing if audiences can recall being exposed to certain messages, and sometimes they go a little deeper to gauge some level of opinion towards different brands, attitudes towards different brands, receptivity towards marketing campaigns. And so I think you've probably seen these types of surveys on YouTube as well. This is about process evaluation, and these surveys go out to a wide sampling of target demographics. So this is more in line with what should be done. Of course, doing these types of surveys can involve significant marketing budgets. Okay, next, and this is important. Don't use a single cross-sectional survey. This is often what happens when campaigns survey people who came to their campaign event, and I already talked about the problems with doing that. But imagine, for instance, a campaigner does a survey at the end of the campaign of the general public, and they find that 65% of people do the behavior they were encouraging. Does that mean the campaign was a success? Well, they don't really know that unless they ask the same questions previous to the campaign being launched. So basically at time 0, before the campaign, they would ask, how much do you engage in the behavior? And then after the campaign, they would ask again, how much do you engage in the behavior? And then some comparisons could be made, and it would be somewhat reasonable to conclude that the changes in behavior were due to the campaign, as long as you can control for other things that might have been happening at the same time, perhaps a competing campaign. Another good thing to do in evaluation is comparing the exposed, people who are exposed to the message, to those not exposed. And so this is what I did in my experiment where I was looking at message effects. There were those exposed to information about how clean recyclables need to be, and there were those who weren't exposed. And when I saw differences afterwards between those two groups, I was able to conclude that there was an effect caused by that message manipulation. And so then you would ask one group, the exposed group, that would be BE, how much do you engage in the behavior? And then you would ask the same question to the BN group, the group that was not exposed. Now, of course, doing this requires you to have two comparable groups. And if you do a national campaign, you don't have an unexposed group, right? So you need to have equivalent groups that are only different with respect to one getting the message and the other not. And a lot of times that's difficult, especially with large-scale interventions and campaigns. Another thing to do, and it kind of combines these last two, this is kind of the ideal, is to look at those who were not exposed and those who were exposed before and after the campaign. And so the idea there is, in theory, assuming there were no other changes out in society during the campaign, those who were not exposed, so that's BN0 at time 1, so the light blue, they should be the same in terms of their behavior as BN1. So it's the same group, those who were not exposed, going from time 0 to time 1. If they weren't exposed to the campaign, in theory their behavior shouldn't change. If their behavior does change, it wasn't due to the campaign, it was due to some other factors that then need to be controlled for when you're looking at how the behavior of those exposed at time 0, so BE0, is less than or greater than, depending on the behavior of those who were exposed at time 1. So those who weren't exposed, their behavior shouldn't change from time 0 to time 1, and those who were exposed should have the same type of behavior at time 0 before message exposure, because all three of those groups weren't exposed. The only group that was exposed was the exposed group at the second measurement. So that's an ideal approach because it allows to show the before and after effects, but then it also allows to control for any confounding factors where the change would have happened because of other reasons unrelated to the intervention, right? And so that's why you have that control group. And by measuring them before and after the intervention, you can see if they changed in ways unrelated to the intervention. And that helps clarify whether the intervention was successful. Of course, this method, all of these methods, each stage involves increasing complexity, right? Increasing difficulty. And so achieving this highest level of intervention evaluation it involves a lot of resources. So I can't say everyone should always do this because it really requires a balancing of needs and available resources. Okay, and then finally, do measure actual behavior. This is really important. So in my recycling study, I was able to measure whether people use the recycling bin or the rubbish bin. That's a straightforward, easy behavioral measure. It's obvious what they did, and it would be weird to conclude they did something other than what I observed. It's pretty obvious what they did. But how about my measure of contamination level? So here's actually the scale I use to gauge the level of contamination. I should disclose I wasn't the one measuring the contamination. It was my research assistant who was digging these cups out of the bin and looking at them, examining them, and ticking off the level of contamination. This is not as clear-cut as what bin individuals use. Now, why didn't I do something like weigh the amount of contamination? Certainly a cup that's contaminated weighs more than one that's not contaminated. And if I have a sensitive enough scale, I guess I could make that work. But I would need a really high precision scale, and I'd need to control for things like slight variations in how much each cup weighs. The cups don't all weigh exactly the same amount, at least I doubt they do. They're close, but not identical. Also, when participants would rinse their cups, they'd probably leave some water in it, and I don't want to count the water, right? So I couldn't use a weighing scale. A weighing scale would be the most accurate way to gauge the weight of the cup and its contents, but it might not be the most accurate way to gauge the level of contamination. I decided, after chatting with I have to also say, not my research assistant, my collaborator. My collaborator on this project, who did the dirty work, we decided that, the 5-point scale is efficient, it's going to get us what we need, and it allows for fast recording. He was able to, after each experimental session, quickly take out the cups and mark them and then get ready for the next session. All right, so that's all I wanted to talk about in this first lecture on media evaluation. I covered some key concepts, mostly focusing on process and outcome evaluation, the types of questions that should be asked, and then I gave an example, I guess, throughout this lecture of how I've explored some of these concepts in my own work. Go ahead and check out part 2, where I present a case study of media evaluation and revisit some of these concepts. You can find the link in the description. Thank you.